This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Xcast X-Files Podwatch, episode 37, covering Wetwired and Talitha Cumi. I'm your host, Carl Sweeney, and I'm joined once again by a man I'd wager has forgotten more about the X-Files than most people will ever know, and his name is Chris Knowles. Hi, Chris.
Hello. Here we are.
Here we are, indeed. So, just a reminder, Chris is the co-author of the Complete X-Files book, and his blog is The Secret Sun. All right, then. So, just before we get into these two episodes, I thought maybe a word on the series at this point. So, this is obviously the end of season 3. I'd imagine it had been a very challenging, taxing, but rewarding year for everybody involved. What do you know? What can you tell us about how people were feeling as the show came to the end of its third season?
Everybody was exhausted.
Yeah.
Chris Carter had begun work on Millennium at this point. They were in talks for the feature film. I mean, there was a lot going on. This was a very, very busy period for them. It was all hands on deck. They had a lot of weather problems.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So shooting was kind of problematic at this point in time. A lot of rain at this, towards the end of this season, and it held up production quite a bit. Yeah, a lot of things going. The series is going like gangbusters. It's really picking up. It's really at its peak of, hip, cool hotness. It's, a media sensation. David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson are on magazine covers everywhere you look. It's really a bona fide phenomenon that tapped into the pop culture zeitgeist. A lot of big fans in rock groups and things like that. And we'd see songs in the key of X, that kind of thing. Just a very exciting time. Chris Carter has always said that this was his, favorite season of all. They felt like they were firing on all cylinders, basically.
Yeah, so this is May 1996 when both of these episodes were first broadcast. So the first one is Wetwired. It's the 23rd episode of the season. Written by Matt Beck, directed by Rob Bowman. And this is the episode in which the agents investigate a series of murders which they link back to television viewing. So before we get into, how good this is as an episode, what can you tell me about how Matt Beck got involved here? Because I believe he was the visual effects supervisor, and he ended up writing this script. Do you know what the context is for that?
Here's the deal. One thing that particularly Frank Spotnitz has always said is that you can't go by the credits on X-Files episodes. This is actually a quote-unquote John Gilnitz script. John Scheiben, Vince Gilligan, and Frank Spotnitz, I believe, wrote the lion's share of the script. It could be that Matt Beck had the original, maybe he did a treatment. I don't know how much of the script he actually wrote. I believe that Chris Carter actually had done some rewrites on this. So really what's going on in 1013 is that, with the exception of Darren Morgan, scripts are really passed around. They go through different levels of rewrites and things like that. So I don't know how much of this is actually a Matt Beck script. I mean, it feels to me like classic archetypal X-Files. You're hitting all the story beats that you see throughout, particularly this season. And I believe that most of this is, like I said, a Scheiben, Gilligan, Spotnitz production.
Yeah, I'm sure I've seen an interview with Carter from around this time, or maybe early in the fourth season, where he said that he rewrote in some way, shape, or form 22 of the 24 episodes. He either wrote or rewrote them.
Well, see, here's the thing. I believe I did put it in the book. Tim Manners said something very interesting. He said, it doesn't matter who wrote the script, whose name you see on the credits. He said that everything went through Chris Carter's word processor. That the voice of the characters, particularly the patter between Mulder and Scully, sort of the jargon, the techno-babble in some ways, the voices of the characters, particularly the main characters, are almost always a Chris Carter rewrite. So every script is polished by the writing team and goes to Chris Carter before it's put into production. And you can really kind of tell this. I mean, it's interesting because Darren Morgan was very good at mimicking Chris Carter's distinctive type of language, particularly in the Mulder Scully patter. There are just certain passages in this particular story that very much feel like Carter to me. Particularly some of the Scully scenes.
Right. Okay.
It gets to the point that no matter who is credited as the writer, those four, what I call the four horsemen of the X-Files, yeah, are working on it at some stage of production. I mean, they become the four executive producers. Towards the end of the series, Vince Gilligan is basically running the writer's room. Frank is essentially the showrunner in the last season. That's the thing that I think is very important for fans to realize about this particular season, is that this is really the season where that four core writing team really start to take shape. Because don't forget, I mean, Scheiben is new this season. Vince Gilligan is still relatively new, but they really gel. Frank, Vince, and John really hit it off. They really gel. They really feel, that they're on the same playing field. And that really becomes the voice of the X-Files from this point forward.
All right, so questions of authorship aside, what about this episode then? How well do you think it works?
Oh, I think this is a solid 10. This is one of my favorite episodes. It's interesting because what this really is a kind of almost like a remake of Blood. It's following the same story arc. It's dealing with the same issues. But I think it does so. I mean, Blood to me is a really solid season 2 episode, very well done. But it's kind of maybe a little too light for the subject matter. This episode is just pitch black. I mean, it's just dark as pitch. The treatment this theme is given is really more appropriate to how, disturbing and in real life this is. I mean, this is, all based on real technological issues, potentials, things like that. I mean, the whole issue of subliminals, they talk about the history of subliminals. I mean, subliminals are still used today. I mean, they're not used perhaps maybe in the same way that they once were in the 50s and so on, the things that they reference in the script. But I mean, it's everywhere. Subliminals are everywhere. So this is a very dark episode that I think does the subject matter justice. Really puts across the feeling of paranoia and dread that the X-Files, I think, did on its best days.
One area where it differs from Blood is that here, obviously, Scully gets caught up in the events. What did you think of Gillian Anderson's performance? She kind of embodies that paranoia and dread that you spoke of, I suppose.
Oh, it's fantastic. And especially the way it develops. It doesn't just pop out of the ether. You see her step by step being pulled under this magic spell. It's like a disease. It's a progressive disease. And she plays it so beautifully. And, just these kind of white knuckle scenes of the scene in her mother's house. Just brilliantly played by everyone. And the thing I really love is that David Duchovny sort of got a lot of criticism for maybe underplaying too often. But I love the way he underplays that scene, because you really get a sense of Mulder as a character. It almost feels to me that in moments like this, he has almost like an autonomic response to get very cool, to shut down his emotions. A real life situation like that could get very bad very quickly. And you see that Mulder's mind, the thing I love with David Duchovny is it's, the way you can see the gears working, yeah. That's something he really plays well. So, I see Mulder here as a character who is a professional, and that's when his professional instincts kick in, his training kicks in, almost like he has experience with like hostage negotiation, crisis management. And that I think is just played really beautiful. And Sheila Larkin, let's give her props too, because she just does a fantastic job here as well. And it's just such a powerful emotional moment, and just really gives you a sense of the depth of the Mulder Scully, this great romance in the classical sense, not in the the Harlequin romance sense.
There's that's a great scene. There's a couple of other Duchovny moments I think are worthy of singling out, which are the scene where he's with the lone gunman and he finds out that he's got to go along and identify this body.
Oh God, yeah,
that's a great moment. And also that scene with the body as well, when the sort of camera stays on him for a moment or two.
And again, it's the same phenomenon I spoke about with the confrontation with Scully, is that his training is kicking in. He's controlling his emotions, and it's almost like he shuts off part of himself to cope with the stress of the whole crisis, which I just think it's good writing and it's good acting. And it's just really strong, instinctual storytelling.
I always thought it was interesting when the X-Files would deal with the medium of television in some way. And it happens a few times through the run of the series. And here, obviously, it's built into the premise of the episode. And there's some back and forth with Mulder and Scully where they talk about the causal link between TV and violence. And as I recall, Scully sort of puts forward the argument that there is a real link, and Mulder's much more dubious about that.
Well, that's actually a reference because the X-Files have been getting a lot of criticism in the media for, some of the explicit gore and horror. And this is also a time when there's sort of a moral panic around music. Marilyn Manson is very big at this stage of the game, and he's very much a source of controversy on talk shows and the TV news. So that is the X-Files writing team sort of addressing the criticism that they were receiving, from the moral watchdogs of the media and so on. So they did that a lot. They would sort of dig at criticism. I mean, there's a great scene in Never Again when one of the victims is lining her birdcage with Entertainment Weekly, and that was because Glenn Morgan was upset about the review. Entertainment Weekly had given The Field Where I Died an F.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So he was very upset about that. So yeah, I mean, just sort of those sly, under the radar digs at their critics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Before we move on to the next episode, so you get a scene at the end here with X and the Smoking Man. In the earlier parts of the episode, X wasn't present. Is he called the plainclothes man? The guy who...
Yeah, Tim Henry, who was also in Colony.
You sort of get a sense that X's time may be up here, and possibly the actor wasn't available as much as they wanted him or something. I don't know.
Well, this is an interesting backstory here. Stephen Williams had signed on to do a show called L.A. Heat, but he had told the producers that he was very interested in continuing to play X. Apparently he wasn't available for this shoot, so basically what they had done is that they had cast Tim Henry in this role to basically read X's lines. So all those scenes with Mulder and the plainclothesman are supposed to be X. They were X in the original script, but it was rewritten to be plainclothesman. There's some, it's interesting, there's a little bit of controversy here because Stephen Williams at a Supernatural convention sort of went on this rant that he was fired because there were conflicts with David Duchovny. And it's interesting because the article that this was written in was mysteriously vanished from the internet.
Oh.
He had just gone on this rant and said that Duchovny was uncomfortable with him because Stephen Williams had worked with the X-Files crew on 21 Jump Street. I guess there were some conflicts there. I don't know if it's ever been brought up again, but I just think it's interesting that sort of came out. Maybe it was a bit facetious. Maybe he was sort of half kidding. X to me is such a great character. I mean, one of my favorite supporting characters. Stephen Williams is a tremendous actor, did a wonderful job with that character. I really was upset when his character was killed off. I don't think Marita Covarrubias was a suitable replacement for him. But there actually was, earlier in this season, and I believe towards the end of the second season, they always were hesitant to overuse characters. And I guess there was some discussion within the staff that X was just too much like a Deus Ex Machina in some ways, that he would just pop in when Mulder couldn't solve a case and tell him everything that's going on and then disappear back into the shadows. And people thought that that was maybe getting a little cliched. So there was some controversy, again, like I said, with his relationship towards David Duchovny, but also in the writer's room. You know, even in this episode where he's only in the last few scenes, you really get a sense of what a strong screen presence he is.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, he's still around for the next couple of episodes. So perhaps we should move on to talk about Talitha Cumi then. Talitha Cumi is the 24th episode of the third season. It has a teleplay by Chris Carter, and the story is credited to Carter and David Duchovny. The episode was directed by R.W. Goodwin, and this is the episode that begins by introducing the character of Jeremiah Smith, who possesses the ability to heal people's wounds. Alright, so we're ended up recording some of these episodes out of order, and in a future episode, people will hear you say that the mythology starts to take a bit of a wrong turn from Talitha Cumi onwards to around about, I think you said up to Terma. So maybe you could just develop that thought for me, maybe. Why did the mythology go wrong here?
Well,
Exactly.
I don't know if it went wrong for everybody, but one of the issues here, again, is that Chris Carter is very preoccupied with Millennium and is basically the showrunner for the first half of the season of Millennium, the primary showrunner. I believe Ken Horton takes over later on in that season. You know, I just kind of felt personally that it lacked focus and was throwing in a little too much sort of James Bond kind of melodrama for me. I loved the mythology best when it stayed more down to earth, more shadowy, where you felt less certain about what you're actually watching, particularly like, again, that Dwayne Barry Ascension When Breath trilogy. It just felt very, it was on a much more human scale. I mean, once they start going to Russia and you're having people being chased by horses and trucks and, it's losing sight of what made the mythology so effective. One thing about this episode is that, well, Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz are working on the script. They're exhausted. I mean, they're working 20-hour days since September or July, whenever the show began production. There's a lot of Talitha Cumi that I like quite a bit, but there's a lot that I kind of felt, there's some retreads. They were retreading some of One Breath. That's one of Chris Carter's favorite episodes. I like this episode, quite a bit, and there are some very good scenes in here. But at the same time, I feel like the mythology is kind of going into a wilderness period.
Okay, yeah, well, I'd certainly say it's the weakest season finale up to this point. I don't think it compares to the Erlenmeyer Flask or Anasazi.
Oh, not. I mean, it's not even in the same ballpark as those.
No,
episodes.
I wouldn't say it is. No.
I mean, those are classic. Those are just dead bang classics.
Absolutely. In terms of the comparison to One Breath, I see what you mean, because you've got like the Mulder Smoking Man confrontation. You've got Mulder and X at odds with each other. Both of those things have been done before to greater dramatic effect, I'd say.
Yes.
One of the interesting things about this episode is the so-called Grand Inquisitor sequence. So I'm always impressed by the sort of range of cultural references on the X-Files, sort of highbrow or lowbrow. Quote, we're using quote marks because, it's debatable how useful the terms are. But you've got this sequence inspired by Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov.
And the shootout at the restaurant is at the Brothers K. I don't know.
Yeah, and you've got the fast food restaurant named after it as well, yeah. In The Brothers Karamazov, it's kind of a parable one of the characters tells to another character where Christ returns to 16th century Spain, Seville, and the Grand Inquisitor tells him why he should have stayed incognito, basically.
Yeah, should have stayed dead, yeah.
Yeah. Here we got Jeremiah Smith kind of in the Jesus role, and the Smoking Man as the Inquisitor. I mean, I have mixed feelings about how this plays out on screen, but what do you think?
It's very inconsistent. The first conversation is very purple and just doesn't work. The second conversation is much stronger. The writing is much stronger. It's more focused. I love Roy Thinnis. I think I'm a huge fan of the Invaders, and of course, I mean, the X-Files just takes big chunks out of that show left and right. You know, the whole thing with when the aliens sort of melt away. I mean, that's taken straight from the Invaders. There's, you know, if you watch the Invaders, it's basically 2 seasons of mythology, of X-Files mythology. I mean, there's so much. You know, and it's interesting when you talk about those literary references. I mean, David Duchovny, you know, was an English major. I think he was, you know, I believe he was going for his PhD at one point.
Yeah, that's right. I believe so. Yeah, and he was.
Yeah. So he was a very well-read, you know, extraordinarily intelligent man. You know, he understands these references backwards and forwards. The interesting backstory here is that he was on a plane with Roy Thinnis, and Roy Thinnis had, you know, introduced himself to David Duchovny, and, you know, said, you know, I'm a big fan of your show, and it's like, I'd love to, you know, appear on it if you could figure out a way to do that. And David Duchovny had broached the idea to Chris Carter, and Chris Carter was a huge Invaders fan as well, so he created this character for him, you know, especially for Roy Thinnis. You know, it's funny because those scenes feel a bit inconsistent, you know, a bit fuzzy, a bit purple at times. But William B. Davis loved playing those scenes. Apparently, he and Roy Thinnis really hit it off. I mean, they're sort of from the same generation of actors, and they really love playing against each other. For Davis, I believe this was one of his favorite episodes. You know, there are a lot of good moments in this. I mean, I love the scene between Cigarette Smoking Man and Tina Mulder, you know, at the beach house. That's just a fantastic scene. And then we start to get the sense that they had a relationship, you know, that Cigarette Smoking Man may well be the father of both Mulder and Samantha, which, you know, I think is pretty clear towards the end of the series. You know, I think the fight between Mulder and X is very well shot. It's very well staged. But, you know, it's like, that sort of feels like the scene from Endgame, and you know, the scenes with Tina Mulder in the hospital kind of feel like one breath, and you know, and then, you know, he's approaching Skinner again, you know, wanting to get in touch with Cigarette Smoking Man again, you know, track him down. Yeah, I mean, this is what writers do when they're exhausted, is they sort of do a greatest hits episode. For instance, I mean, the cliffhanger here is just like, really? Is that's all you got? I mean, it's so weak. Alien Bounty Hunter was an interesting character when he's first presented, but he almost starts to feel like a pest at this point in time. It's just like, go away, you know, you're annoying. Not a great episode, certainly one of the weakest season finales. But at the same time, through this storyline into Herrenvolk, it's like Herrenvolk almost feels like homework to me. It's just like, okay, you know, this happened and this happened and this happened. But at the same time, it's like they're setting up plot points that are really going to pay off later on in that season and, you know, into the rest of the mythology. So, you know, even if these episodes kind of feel like an endurance test, this stretch of the mythology, they're putting a lot of interesting themes into play that are really going to pay off and really become sort of fan favorites in a sense.
The cliffhanger, I was going to mention that too. I think it feels like kind of a mid-season two-parter cliffhanger, doesn't it? It doesn't feel like...
It's not a cliffhanger. It's not a cliffhanger, though. I mean, you know, it's just like, okay, so the pest is here. Whatever. Nobody was waiting all summer. Oh, I've got to see what happens when the pest chases Mulder and Scully and, you know, Jeremiah Smith. I mean, nobody was like marking the calendar to see how that story, you know, line paid off. It's just very weak.
Fortunately, our listeners don't have to wait all summer to see what happens with the Alien Bounty Hunter and Jeremiah Smith, because tomorrow it's Herrenvolk and Home. But in the meantime, hopefully people will find us on Twitter at the X_cast or on Facebook. Find the Xcast podcast fan group, X-Files Basement. Until next time, listeners, trust no one.